Good morning, dear students, and welcome back to our story for this term, Jane Eyre. We stopped where Mr. Rochester had an important visitor. His name was Mr. Mason from West Indies. He said that he was an old friend to Mr. Rochester, but Mr. Rochester's expression when he heard the name wasn't like it. He actually got serious and angry, and his face turned white. Okay, later that night, Mr. Rochester and Mr. Mason kept talking for an hour. So let's continue our story and see what happened. So we're going to start from page 50. I'm sorry, page 14. Okay, let's read together.
That night, Mr. Rochester and Mr. Mason talked for a long time. At last, very late at night, they went to bed. Soon everyone in the house was asleep. Suddenly, I woke up. I heard a terrible scream from somewhere over my head. Then everything was very quiet again. I listened carefully, and then I heard a lot of noise from above my head. There seemed to be fighting in the room above. Then there was another scream. "Help! Help!" someone shouted. There was more fighting. Then a voice called out, "Rochester, come quickly, help me!" A door opened, and I heard someone running up the stairs to the attic. I quickly put on some clothes and opened my door. Everybody in the house was awake now. The visitors were all standing outside their doors. "What's happening? Is there a fire? What was that noise?" they asked. Mr. Rochester came down from the attic. "Please don't worry," he told his friends. "Everything is all right." "But what's happening?" somebody asked. "One of the servants had a bad dream and started to scream," Mr. Rochester said. "But everything is all right now. Please go back to bed." Slowly, all Mr. Rochester's visitors returned to their rooms. I too went back to my room, but I did not go back to bed. I sat and looked out of the window. The house was very quiet now. There were no sounds from the attic. Then someone knocked on my door. I opened it. Mr. Rochester stood outside. "Jane, come with me, please," he told me, "but come quietly. Follow me." I followed Mr. Rochester up to the attic. He unlocked the door of a room, and we went inside. "Wait here," Mr. Rochester told me. I stood next to the door. There was another door on the opposite side of the room. From behind this door, I could hear a terrible sound. It was like an angry animal. Mr. Rochester left me and went through this door. Once again, I heard that terrible, cruel laugh. Was Grace Poole behind the door? Mr. Rochester spoke to someone inside the room and then came out and locked the door again. "Come here, Jane," he told me quietly. I came further into the room. There was a large bed in the room. Mr. Mason was lying on the bed. His face was white and his eyes were closed. There was a lot of blood on his shirt. He did not move. "Is he dead?" I asked. "No," answered Mr. Rochester. "He isn't badly hurt, but I must go and bring the doctor for him. Will you stay with him until I get back?" The man on the bed moved and tried to speak. Mr. Rochester turned to him. "Don't try to talk, Mason. Jane, do not speak to him, please. There must be no conversation between you." Mr. Rochester hurried out of the room. I waited for him with the silent man on the bed. I was frightened. I knew that Grace Poole was in the next room. For a long time I waited for Mr. Rochester to return. When will he come back? I asked myself. At last morning came, and Mr. Rochester returned with the doctor. While the doctor was looking after Mr. Mason, Mr. Rochester spoke to me. "Thank you for all your help, Jane. Mason is going to leave Thornfield Hall now. The doctor will take him away," he told me. We helped Mr. Mason down the stairs and out of the house. It was still early, and the other people in the house were still asleep. "Take care of poor Mason," said Mr. Rochester to the doctor. "Soon he will be able to go back home to the West Indies." Before he left, Mr. Mason said something very strange. "Look after her, Rochester," he said. "Promise to look after her." Mr. Rochester looked sad. "I promise. I will always look after her. I promise. I will always look after her." I started to go back to the house. "Don't go, Jane," said Mr. Rochester. "Come into the garden. Talk to me." We went into the garden. "What a night," he said. "Were you frightened, Jane?" "Yes, I was frightened. Up there in the next room, there was someone... a terrible laugh."
So let's stop here and summarize quickly what happened that night. Okay, when Mr. Mason came later that night, he spent a long time speaking with Mr. Rochester. And Jane was in her room trying to sleep as it was late at night. But she heard something different that night. First, she heard like an argument and loud noises. And after that, she heard a scream. And after that, she heard another scream. It was help, help. And then someone called out for Rochester and said, "Rochester, come here quickly." So everybody was awake, and Jane didn't understand what was going on. And after the noise ended, Mr. Rochester called Jane and told her to come with him quickly. What happened is that there was someone in the room lying on a bed with blood covering him. That was Mr. Mason. What happened to him? Jane did not understand, but she didn't ask many questions. Only Mr. Rochester told her that he's not dead and he's going to go to a doctor to bring a doctor to him to treat him. And he asked from Jane to sit beside him and to look after him. But they are not allowed or supposed to talk to each other. There shouldn't be any conversations between Jane and Mr. Mason until Mr. Rochester is back with the doctor. And that's what happened. Mr. Rochester came back with the doctor with him, and the doctor treated Mr. Mason and took him. And he said he will be okay, and soon he will be able to go home to the West Indies. But Mr. Mason, while he was leaving, he said something very strange. It was even strange to Jane. He said, "Promise to take care of her." He said to Rochester, "Promise to take care of her." And Rochester replied that promise by saying that he will always look after her. Who was she, and look after her from what? And what is the relation of that person to Mr. Mason and Mr. Rochester? This is what we're going to find out. So let's continue reading into page 17 and we're going to understand more.
"Mr. Rochester, will Grace Poole go away now?" "No," he replied. "But don't worry about Grace Poole. Try to forget about her. She isn't dangerous. It is Mason I'm worrying about." I was surprised to hear this. "Mr. Mason? But he is frightened. He can't hurt you." Mr. Rochester looked sad. "I know Mason does not want to hurt me, but he could say something that will hurt me. I shall be happier when he goes back to the West Indies." Later that day, I got a surprising letter. Mrs. Reed, my aunt, was dying and she wanted to see me. It was a long journey to her home. When I got there, I heard that my cousin John was dead. Mrs. Reed was very ill. At first, she did not want to speak to me. Then one day, when I was sitting by her bed, she showed me a letter. It was from my uncle, my father's brother, who lived in Madeira. This was the letter. Dear Mrs. Reed, please help me. I want to find my brother's daughter, Jane Eyre. I am a rich man, and I have no children. I want Jane Eyre to come and live with me. Yours sincerely, John Eyre. I read the letter and looked at the date on it. But Mrs. Reed, I said, this is an old letter. You got it 3 years ago. I know, she said, but I never liked you, Jane Eyre. After I read the letter, I wrote to your uncle. I told him you were dead. I told him you died at Lowood School. Now go away, leave me. Soon afterwards, Mrs. Reed died, and I returned to Thornfield Hall. It was summer, and the fields around Thornfield Hall were very quiet and beautiful. For me, it was the most beautiful place in the world. It was my home now. Adele will be pleased to see me, I thought. But what about Mr. Rochester? He is the person I most want to see. But does he want to see me? Perhaps by now he is already married to Blanche Ingram. If they are not already married, they will be married very soon. I felt sad when I thought about Mr. Rochester and Blanche Ingram. So I must soon leave this beautiful place, I thought. I can't stay here when Mr. Rochester is married. I will never see Thornfield Hall again. And worse than that, I will never see Mr. Rochester again. As I came near the house, I met Mr. Rochester. When I saw that he looked pleased to see me, I felt happier. Adele and Mrs. Fairfax were happy to see me too. The visitors have all left now, said Mrs. Fairfax. It is very quiet here. It is good to see you again. Yes, this is my home, I thought. I've always been happy here. How can I leave it? I started to work, teaching Adele again. Everything was the same as before. Mr. Rochester still said nothing about getting married to Blanche Ingram. Then one evening he saw me in the garden. Come and talk to me, Jane, he said. I went towards him. Now, I thought, he's going to tell me that he is going to get married. Are you happy here, Jane? He asked. Yes, I am. Very happy, I answered. And you like Adele and Mrs. Fairfax? Very much, I said. You'll be sad to leave them, he said. I looked away. Now he is going to tell me that I must leave because he is going to be married, I thought. I looked at him. Yes, I answered. I will be very sad to leave. But you must leave, you know, Mr. Rochester said. Must I? Must I leave soon? Yes, soon. Then you are going to get married? Yes, I am going to get married. Adele must go to school and you must get a new job. I will find you one, far from here. Far from here? I asked. But then I'll never see Thornfield Hall again and I'll never see you again, Mr. Rochester. Oh, when you are far from here, you'll soon forget me, he said. No, I thought. You will forget me, perhaps, but I will never forget you. Never, I answered him at last, and I started to cry. I could not speak. He watched me carefully. Then at last he spoke again. Perhaps you do not need to go, he said. Perhaps you can stay here when I am married. Did Mr. Rochester think that I had no feelings? Did he not understand how I felt? Were my feelings so unimportant? I now felt angry. No, I told him. I could never stay. I will not stay. Miss Ingram will be your wife. I know that I am not rich and beautiful like Miss Ingram. I am poor and unimportant. But I can still feel sadness. And if you marry Miss Ingram, I must leave here. Mr. Rochester looked at me, and then he smiled. I don't want you to go, Jane. And I am not going to marry Miss Ingram. Don't get excited. I want you to stay here. It's you I want to marry. I could not believe him. Now you are laughing at me, I said. No, I am not, he answered. I want you to marry me, Jane. Will you marry me? He looked at me so seriously that at last I did believe him. Mr. Rochester wanted to marry me. He wanted me to be his wife. Yes, I will marry you, I answered. I will make you happy, Jane, he said. No one will stop us, he continued, with a strange, half-sad look. I could not understand that look, but I was too happy to be worried about it. It grew dark. The wind began to blow, and it started to rain. So we walked together back to the house. My wedding day was only a month later. 2 nights before the wedding, I was in bed asleep. My wedding dress was in the room. It was a windy night. The wind made a strange sound. Suddenly I woke up. There was a light in the room. I thought it was morning, but it was still dark outside. Someone was in my room. Was it Mrs. Fairfax? Was it Grace Poole? It was neither of them. It was a woman, but I did not know her. She was a big woman, tall and strong. Her black hair was long and thick. Her clothes were long and white. At first I did not see her face. She took my dress and held it in front of her. She looked at herself in the mirror. Then I saw her face. It was the most terrible face. The woman's eyes were large and red, and her face was purple. She looked angry, cruel, and frightening. Then she took my dress and angrily tore it to pieces. She threw the pieces of the dress on the floor. Next, she went to the window and looked out. Then she started to come towards my bed. I was so frightened that I could not move. I could not scream for help. I lay still in bed. Is she going to kill me? I thought. But suddenly the light disappeared and the room went dark. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was shining. At once I remembered that strange and frightening woman. Did it all really happen? Or was it a dream? Did she really come into my room in the middle of the night?
So these are the end of our pages for today. So let's go over them and breathe them and see exactly what happened. When Mr. Rochester went away with the doctor, he said something strange to Mr. Rochester, which promised me to take care of her. And Mr. Rochester kept that promise by saying, I promise I will always look after her. Okay. And shortly after that, Jane received a strange letter. It was from her aunt, Mrs. Reed. Okay, she wanted to see her. It seemed that she was dying and she wanted her to come and pay a visit. So Jane decided to travel and meet her aunt, and that took her several weeks. When she arrived to Mrs. Reed's house, she learned that her cousin John was dead, and now even Mrs. Reed was dying. When she was sitting with her, she told her that there was a letter from her uncle, her father's brother, John Eyre, what was it about and what he was asking. He actually said in the letter, after Mrs. Reed finally gave it to Jane to read it, that he was trying to find his brother's daughter. He's very rich and he doesn't have any children, and he wants to give her everything and he wants her to live with him. And then Mrs. Reed said that this letter came to you from your uncle. And when Jane checked the date of the letter, it was 3 years ago. So she asked her aunt, "Why you never mentioned that letter before?" So her aunt simply replied, "I never liked you, Jane. I replied to your uncle saying that you were dead at Lowood School. She was cruel even when she was dying. But at the end, she decided to show her the letter, and she died shortly after that." Jane went back to Thornfield Hall and she looked at the place. It was very beautiful, and she felt that it's her home. She never wants to leave it. But she learned that soon Adele will grow up and she will have to move from the house, and so will Jane, as Mr. Rochester must remarry. When she went inside the house, she saw that Mr. Rochester already has married Blanche Ingram, or soon to be marrying her. But when she went, she didn't find that he got married, but she actually felt them happy to see her, whether it's Mr. Rochester, Adele, or Mrs. Fairfax. And she told him that Thornfield Hall is her home now. One night, Mr. Rochester was trying to speak to Jane, and he asked her if she likes this house, and she said yes. But he told her that she has to go and find a job because he's going to get married and Adele will leave. Jane felt rather sad, but after a short conversation between them, Mr. Rochester surprised Jane by telling her that he wants to marry her instead of Blanche Ingram. The one, she is the one he is interested in her. And of course, Jane shared the same interest in Mr. Rochester, and she was going to feel sad if he married someone else. So when he asked her to marry him, she of course said yes. Okay, now we're going to answer the pages in the end. Now go to page 40 and let's answer the questions from page 20, I'm sorry, page 12 to 21. Okay, so we're going to start by answering question 14 here. We're going to finish the sentences of letters A to E by choosing from F to J. So, Mr. Rochester's surprised face went white when? Okay, let's check from F to J. Mr. Mason arrived from the West Indies. She found Mr. Mason lying on the bed. Graceful is not dangerous. Someone in the attic was screaming. He asked Mr. Rochester to look after someone, a woman. Of course, the answer is F. Mr. Rochester's face got surprised and white when Mr. Mason arrived from the West Indies. Now, B. Mr. Rochester ran up the stairs because, you're right, the answer is I. Someone in the attic was screaming. Very good. Number C. Jane followed Mr. Rochester to the attic where, yes, this is correct. G. She found Mr. Mason lying on the bed with blood on his shirt. And then for the following question, Mr. Rochester tells Jane that Gray's pool is not dangerous. This is correct. This is number H. And the last one, as Mr. Mason left with the doctor the next morning, okay, what is the answer? J. He asked Mr. Rochester to look after someone, a woman. Very good. Now we're going to answer number 15. 15 is a sentence and it has two choices in italic. So we're going to choose the correct one. Number A. Jane's cruel cousin, John, is now correct. He's now dead. She learned that when she visited her aunt, Mrs. Reed. B. 3 years earlier, Mrs. Reed had a letter from Jane's rich or poor uncle. He wanted Jane to live with him in Madeira. Correct, her uncle was rich. C. When Jane returns to Thornfield Hall, Mr. Rochester is not already married to Blanche Ingram. This is correct. He is not already married to Blanche Ingram. And number D. Jane can't or must leave if Mr. Rochester marries Blanche Ingram. She must leave, of course. And the last one is Jane does not accept Mr. Rochester's offer of marriage at once. Finally, because she cannot believe him. Yes, at once. Because at first she thought that he wasn't saying the truth. She didn't believe him. But after that, she did. So the answer is Rochester's offer of marriage at once. Okay, and these are the answers for the pages we took today. And let's wait for another lesson when we learn more about our story. Thank you, students, and goodbye.